My mother's deathbed confession shattered everything I thought I knew about our family. As she lay there, tubes and monitors surrounding her, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered words that would haunt me forever. Before I tell you what I discovered, I need to paint you a picture of who I was before all of this. I was the kind of person who trusted easily. I believed in family above all else. I thought honesty and loyalty were the foundations of any good relationship. My parents raised me to value truth, to never lie, to always do the right thing. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. I had just turned 30 when everything fell apart. I had a good job, a nice apartment, a serious relationship that was heading toward marriage. I thought I had my life figured out. I thought I knew who I was, where I came from, what my family stood for. I couldn't have been more wrong. My childhood was, for the most part, happy. Or at least I thought it was. My parents were strict but loving. They had high expectations for me: good grades, respectful behavior, active participation in extracurriculars. I played soccer from age 6 through high school. I took piano lessons every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for 10 years. I was in the debate club, the honor society, volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. I was a straight-A student, never got lower than a 95 in any class, valedictorian of my high school class with a 4 GPA. I got into a good college on a partial scholarship. My parents were proud of me, or so they always said. They came to every soccer game, every piano recital, every debate competition. They had my report cards magnetized to the refrigerator. They bragged about me to their friends and coworkers. We lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a 2-car garage. The kind of house you see in commercials for furniture or cleaning products. My bedroom was painted lavender, my favorite color, with white furniture and shelves full of books. We had a golden retriever named Buddy who I walked every morning before school. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. But looking back now, with the knowledge I have, I can see the cracks that were always there. They were subtle, easy to explain away when you're a kid, but they were there. My mother had these moments where she'd just stare off into space, her eyes distant and sad. I'd call her name 2 or 3 times before she'd snap back to reality. She'd apologize, say she was just thinking about work or what to make for dinner. But there was something in her expression during those moments. A deep sadness, maybe even grief that didn't match the excuse. My father drank more than was probably healthy. Not stumbling drunk, not missing work or causing scenes, but he'd have a glass of scotch when he got home from work, then another with dinner, then another while watching TV. By bedtime, he'd have gone through 3 or 4 drinks. On weekends, it was more. My mother would sometimes make comments about it. "Don't you think you've had enough?" But he'd brush her off, say he was just relaxing, that he worked hard and deserved to unwind. They rarely showed affection to each other, at least not where I could see. No kissing goodbye in the morning, no holding hands, no cute pet names. When I was little, I asked my mom once why Daddy never kissed her like my friend Sarah's dad kissed her mom. My mother's face did something strange, sort of crumpled, and then quickly smoothed out. She said that different couples show love in different ways, that Daddy showed his love by working hard to provide for us. But even as a kid, I could tell that answer wasn't quite right. There were rooms in our house I wasn't allowed to enter. My father's home office was strictly off limits. The door was always locked, and he was the only one with a key. He said it was because he kept important work documents in there, things that were confidential. But one time when I was about 12, I managed to pick the lock with a bobby pin, just being a curious kid, not looking for anything in particular. Before I could even get a good look around, my father caught me. I'd never seen him so angry. He yelled at me, actually yelled, which he almost never did. He made me promise never to go in there again, made me swear on my grandfather's grave. I promised, scared by his reaction, and I never tried again. But I always wondered what was in there that was so important to hide. There were phone calls my parents would take in private, their voices hushed and urgent. They'd get a call, look at the screen, and then quickly walk into another room, closing the door behind them. Sometimes I'd try to listen at the door, but they'd speak too quietly for me to make out words. Once, when I was 15, I picked up the landline extension in my room just as my mother answered downstairs. I heard a man's voice say, "You can't keep hiding this forever," before my mother hissed, "I told you never to call here," and hung up. When I asked her about it later, she said it was just a telemarketer, but her hands were shaking. I remember one time when I was about 7 years old, a woman came to our door. It was a Saturday afternoon. My mother answered, and I watched from the hallway, half hidden behind the wall. The woman was probably in her 40s with dark hair and tear-stained cheeks. She was crying, saying something about telling her the truth and she deserves to know. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard her say, "She has the right and you can't keep pretending." My mother's face went white. She actually went pale, all the color draining from her cheeks. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her so I couldn't hear. They talked for maybe 2 minutes, with the woman getting more agitated and my mother speaking in a low, firm voice. Then my mother practically pushed the woman off our porch. The woman left, but she turned back one more time and looked right at me through the window. She had this expression on her face, like she was looking at something precious that she'd lost. When I asked who it was, my mother said it was just someone confused, looking for a different house in our development. But I remember the look on that woman's face. She wasn't confused. She was desperate. And she was looking at me like she recognized me, like she knew me somehow. There were other incidents too, scattered throughout my childhood like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was supposed to be solving. A letter that arrived when I was 13 that my father snatched from the mailbox and immediately burned in the fireplace. He didn't know I saw him do it, but I was watching from the upstairs window. He held the envelope without opening it, looked at the return address, and then went straight to the fireplace and burned it. Just held it in the flames until it turned to ash. A time when I was 16 and answered the phone, only to have the person on the other end say my name in a shocked, almost gasping voice, "Jessica," before hanging up. It was a woman's voice, older, and there was so much emotion in that one word. I tried to call back using *69, but the number was blocked. My grandmother on my father's side, who died when I was 10, trying to tell me something important at the hospital. She was dying of cancer, in and out of consciousness from the pain medication. But during one of her lucid moments, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and pulled me close. "There's something you need to know," she whispered. "About your family, about where you really came from." But before she could say more, my mother was there, pulling me away, saying Grandma needed her rest, that the medication was making her confused. Grandma kept saying, you need to know," over and over, but my mother kept interrupting, loudly asking the nurse if Grandma needed more pain medication, if she was having delusions, if this was normal. They upped her dosage, and she slipped into unconsciousness. She died 3 days later without waking up again. I often wonder what she was trying to tell me. At family gatherings, there was always this tension I couldn't quite name. It was like everyone was acting in a play, hitting their marks and saying their lines, but nobody really meant it. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, would make pointed comments about family secrets and skeletons in closets, and how the truth always comes out eventually. She'd have too much wine at Thanksgiving and start making these vague insinuations. My mother would get tight-lipped and change the subject. My father would suggest maybe Aunt Linda had had enough to drink. My uncle, my father's brother, who I barely knew because he'd moved across the country when I was little, would drink too much at Christmas and start to say something before my father would cut him off. "Tom, don't," my father would say sharply. "Not now, not here." And Uncle Tom would look at me with this expression that was part pity, part guilt, and then he'd pour himself another drink and go silent. Cousins would whisper and stop talking when I approached. I'd walk into a room and conversation would halt. They'd quickly change the subject, start talking about school or movies or anything else. But I'd catch the looks they'd exchange, like they all knew something I didn't. I thought maybe they were just being typical teenagers, having their own inside jokes and dramas. I never imagined they might be keeping secrets about me. There were photos in our house, but not that many considering we were supposedly such a tight-knit family. And the ones we did have were carefully curated. Almost all of them started when I was about 2 years old. There were very few from when I was a baby, and none from before I was born. When I asked about it once, my mother said they'd lost most of the old photos in a flood in our basement. But we'd never had a flood. Our basement was dry and finished, with carpet and everything. It was where I went to play as a kid. There was no water damage, no signs there had ever been flooding. I remember being 11 and having to bring in a baby photo for a school project. I went through all our photo albums and found exactly 3 pictures of myself as a baby, and even those didn't start until I was maybe 8 or 9 months old. There were no newborn pictures, no hospital photos, none of the typical first bath or first Christmas or first anything photos that all my friends' parents had. When I asked my mother about it, she got flustered and said that Bobby's all look the same anyway, that she'd never been big on taking photos. But I'd seen home videos of her more recent ones, and she was constantly taking pictures of everything. It didn't add up. I always just thought our family was a little dysfunctional, like all families are. I'd watch TV shows and movies about families with problems and think, yeah, that's kind of like us. We had our issues, our little quirks and tensions, but so did everyone, right? I had no idea how deep the dysfunction really went. I had no idea that the quirks and tensions weren't just normal family dynamics. They were the result of a massive lie that everyone was working together to maintain. Looking back, I can see how much energy it must have taken for everyone to keep up the charade. How exhausting it must have been to constantly monitor what they said around me, to coordinate their stories, to shut down anyone who threatened to reveal the truth. For decades, they all worked together to keep me in the dark, and they almost succeeded. The warning signs really started to add up in my late 20s. I was engaged to my college boyfriend, Mark. We'd been together for 6 years, and marriage seemed like the natural next step. When I told my parents we were getting engaged, their reaction was strange. My mother started crying, not happy tears, but something else. My father just looked pale and excused himself from the room. They said they were happy for me, but I could tell something was wrong. Then there was the issue with the wedding planning. I wanted to do a big ceremony, invite all our extended family and friends. But my mother kept trying to convince me to do something small, maybe even elope. She said it would be less stressful, more intimate, better for our budget. But I knew money wasn't the issue. My parents had always been comfortable financially. When I pushed back, insisting on a real wedding, my father offered to pay for everything if we just keep it small. That's when I knew something was really wrong. I started asking more questions about our family history. Simple things, like where my grandparents were born, how my parents really met, why we never seemed to visit certain relatives. My parents would give vague answers or change the subject. My mother would suddenly remember she had something urgent to do. My father would get irritated and tell me I was being nosy. Around this same time, I started getting friend requests on social media from people I didn't know, all claiming to be distant relatives. They'd send me messages saying things like, "I've been looking for you for years," or "I have so much to tell you about your family." I thought they were scammers or crazy people. I blocked most of them without responding. Now I realize at least some of them were trying to tell me the truth. The final straw came 6 months before my wedding. I was at my parents' house, helping my mother clean out the attic. We were looking for old family photos to display at the wedding reception. That's when I found a locked metal box hidden behind some old Christmas decorations. I asked my mother what it was, and she practically jumped to grab it from me. She said it was just old tax documents, nothing important. But the look on her face told me it was a lot more than that. I couldn't stop thinking about that box. What could possibly be in there that would make my mother react that way? I started to wonder if maybe my family wasn't who I thought they were. Maybe the perfect suburban life I remembered was just a carefully maintained facade. Maybe there were things about my own history I didn't know. I had no idea how right I was or how much finding out the truth would cost me. The discovery happened 2 months before my wedding in the most unexpected way. My father had a heart attack. He survived, thank God, but it was serious. While he was in the hospital, my mother practically lived there, staying by his side day and night. That meant their house was empty, and I had a key. I told myself I was just going over to water the plants and get their mail. But really, I was going to find that box. I needed to know what was inside. I needed to understand why my parents had been so secretive, so evasive whenever I asked about our family history. The attic was dark and dusty. I had to move piles of old boxes and furniture to get to the back corner where I'd seen my mother hide the metal box. When I finally found it, my hands were shaking. The lock was old and rusted. It took me less than 5 minutes to break it open with a screwdriver from my father's garage. Inside were documents. So many documents. Birth certificates that didn't match what I'd always been told. Letters written in my mother's handwriting, dated from before I was born. Legal documents. Photos of people I'd never seen before. And slowly, as I read through everything, the truth became horrifyingly clear. My parent abandoned another family before ours, and those kids just found us. I sat there on the dusty attic floor for what must have been hours, reading and rereading everything. My brain couldn't process it. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake. But the evidence was right there in black and white. Official documents with stamps and signatures. Photos with dates written on the back. Letters that described things in explicit detail. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I dug deeper into the box, I found more documents. And that's when I discovered the second layer of secrets. The affair partner was supposed to be my godparent. I felt like I was going to be sick. My entire life had been a lie. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about where I came from, none of it was true. The people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me for my entire life. And not just small lies. Fundamental lies about who I was and where I came from. I took photos of everything with my phone. Then I carefully put everything back in the box, locked it as best I could, and put it back where I found it. I needed time to process this. I needed to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront my parents immediately, but another part of me was terrified of what would happen when I did. I drove home in a daze. I don't even really remember the drive. When I got to my apartment, Mark was there, wondering where I'd been. I'd promised to be home hours ago. He could tell something was wrong. I wanted to tell him, but I couldn't form the words. How do you tell someone that your entire identity is a lie? How do you explain that you don't even know who you really are anymore? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every moment of my childhood through this new lens. All those strange incidents that I'd dismissed or explained away, they all made sense now. The pieces were finally falling into place, and the picture they formed was devastating. The first few days after my discovery were some of the darkest of my life. I called in sick to work. I barely ate. I couldn't focus on anything except the documents and photos I'd found. I must have looked at the pictures on my phone 1,000 times, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood, hoping there was some other explanation. Mark knew something was seriously wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. This was too big, too personal. I needed to process it myself first. He was patient with me, bringing me food, holding me when I cried, not pushing for answers even though I could see the worry in his eyes. My mother called several times, wondering why I hadn't visited my father in the hospital. I made excuses. I said I had a stomach bug, that I didn't want to risk getting him sick while he was recovering. The truth was, I couldn't face them. I didn't trust myself not to scream at them, to demand answers in the middle of a hospital waiting room. I started experiencing panic attacks. I'd be fine one moment, and then suddenly I couldn't breathe. My heart would race. I'd feel dizzy and disconnected from reality, because that's what it felt like reality itself had become unstable. If my parents could lie about something this fundamental, what else in my life was fake? Could I trust anything they'd ever told me? I became obsessed with the idea that people could look at me and somehow see the truth, like it was written on my face, like everyone had known except me. I started avoiding friends and family. I canceled plans. I stopped answering calls. Mark was worried I was having some kind of breakdown, and honestly, I think I was. The wedding planning came to a complete halt. How could I plan a future when I didn't even understand my past? My mother kept calling about vendor meetings and dress fittings, and I kept making excuses. The thought of standing up in front of all those people, having a celebration built on lies, made me physically ill. About a week after my discovery, I finally started to move from shock into anger. Real, burning, all-consuming rage. How dare they? How dare they lie to me my entire life? How dare they let me build my identity on a foundation of deception? Every family dinner, every holiday, every I love you. It was all tainted now, poisoned by the truth I'd uncovered. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I needed answers. I needed to hear them say it. I needed to look my parents in the eye and watch them try to explain the inexplicable. But I also knew that once I confronted them, there was no going back. This was the end of something, even if I didn't know yet what would come after. I couldn't just confront my parents with what I'd found. I needed more. I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened, every detail, every person involved, every lie that had been told. So I started investigating, digging deeper into my family's past than I ever had before. My first stop was the internet. I spent hours, days actually, searching for names I'd found in the documents. I looked for any trace of the people and events described in those letters and legal papers. What I found shocked me. There were public records, old newspaper articles, court documents. There was a trail if you knew where to look and what to search for. And it confirmed everything I'd found in that box, plus some things I hadn't known, hadn't even suspected. I found birth records that didn't match what I'd been told. Marriage licenses and divorce decrees that revealed relationships I'd never known about. Property records showing addresses where my parents supposedly never lived. Business registrations under different names. Criminal records, in some cases. Court filings for lawsuits and custody battles. The digital paper trail went back decades, and it painted a picture very different from the one I'd grown up with. I also found obituaries. People who had died, people whose names appeared in the documents, people who had been part of this story. I read about their lives, their families, their deaths. In some of those obituaries, I saw my own name listed sometimes under a different surname, sometimes as survived by, when I'd never known these people existed. It was surreal, seeing my name connected to strangers, being part of their official life stories when I'd had no idea they were part of mine. I contacted some of those people who had tried to reach out to me on social media, the ones I'd blocked and ignored, thinking they were scammers or crazy people. I unblocked them and sent careful messages, saying I was interested in learning more about my family history. The responses came flooding in. People who had been trying to reach me for years, who had stories to tell, who had their own pieces of the puzzle. One woman, I'll call her Sarah, had particularly important information. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. I was nervous driving there, not sure what to expect. When I saw her walk in, I felt this strange jolt of recognition, even though I'd never met her before. There was something familiar about her face, her mannerisms. We sat down with our coffees, and she pulled out her own folder of documents and photos. Sarah told me about events that happened before I was born, decisions that were made that affected multiple families, not just mine. She told me about secrets that had been kept to protect reputations, to avoid legal consequences, to maintain social standing. She told me about other people who were affected by what my parents had done, people who had been hurt, people who had spent years trying to find answers just like I was now. She showed me photos. Some of them were of my parents when they were younger, before I was born. But they looked different somehow, not just younger, but like different people. Less burdened, maybe, before they'd accumulated all these secrets. There were photos of other people, too, people I didn't recognize but who Sarah said were family. My family. People I should have known, should have grown up knowing, but who had been kept from me. Sarah told me that my parent abandoned another family before ours, and those kids just found us was just the beginning. There were other secrets, other lies, other people affected. She gave me names, dates, locations. She told me about a whole network of people who knew the truth, who had been silenced or paid off or threatened into keeping quiet. She told me that I wasn't the only one who had been lied to, that there were others searching for the truth just like I was. After meeting with Sarah, I knew I needed professional help. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, like something out of a movie, but I needed someone who could access records I couldn't, who could find people who didn't want to be found, who could put together timelines and connections that I couldn't see. It cost me nearly my entire savings, about $15,000, but I didn't care. I needed to know everything. I needed the whole truth, no matter what it cost. I met with the PI, a middle-aged woman named Detective Morris who had retired from the police force and now ran her own investigation business. I gave her everything. I had copies of all the documents I'd found, names and dates, the information Sarah had provided, my own notes and questions. I told her what I was looking for, the complete truth about my family's history and my own origins. She said it would take time, maybe several weeks. She said some of what I wanted to know might be sealed records or legally protected information, but she'd do her best. 3 weeks later, Detective Morris called me back to her office. She had a report that was over 50 pages long. As I read through it, I felt like I was learning about strangers, not the people who raised me. The report included detailed family trees going back 3 generations, property records showing places my family had lived that I'd never known about, financial documents showing money transfers and payments that didn't make sense, and testimonies from people who had known my parents back when all of this started. The report revealed business dealings I'd never known about. Apparently, my father had been involved in some questionable real estate transactions in his 20s. Money had changed hands that shouldn't have. There were partnerships that had ended badly, lawsuits that had been settled quietly. My mother had connections to people and organizations that surprised me. She'd been part of groups and communities I'd never heard her mention. There were also relationships that had been hidden. People who had been important in my parents' lives before I was born, who had then completely disappeared. A best friend my mother had been inseparable from in college, who was never mentioned, never visited, completely erased from our family narrative. A business partner of my father's who had apparently died under somewhat suspicious circumstances, though nothing was ever proven. The report documented a pattern of secrecy and deception going back years before I was born. It wasn't just about me, I realized. The lying was habitual, almost pathological. My parents had been lying to everyone about everything for decades. They'd lied to their own families of origin. They'd lied to friends and colleagues. They'd lied on official documents. They'd created this entire false narrative of their lives and stuck to it so consistently that eventually, I think, they almost believed it themselves. Detective Morris also found legal records I hadn't known about. Court cases, settlements, restraining orders. There had been legal troubles in my parents' past that they'd never mentioned. Nothing criminal enough to send them to prison, but shady enough to raise serious questions about their character and judgment. I also started digging through my own memories more systematically, writing down everything I could remember that seemed odd or suspicious in hindsight. I got out old photo albums and home videos, watching them with new eyes, looking for clues I'd missed the first time around. And they were there. Once I knew what to look for, I could see the evidence everywhere. In one home video from my 8th birthday party, I caught my mother and aunt having a whispered, intense conversation in the background. The camera wasn't focused on them. It was supposed to be on me blowing out candles, but you could see them in the corner of the frame. My aunt was clearly upset about something, gesturing emphatically. My mother's face was tight with stress. Then they noticed the camera was on and immediately put on smiles. In photo albums, there were pictures that had been removed. You could see the marks where photos had been peeled off the sticky pages, leaving empty spaces in what should have been complete chronological documentation of our family life. Who had been in those photos? What were they showing that needed to be removed? There were also physical inconsistencies I'd never noticed before. In pictures of me as a baby, the house in the background wasn't the house I grew up in. My parents said we'd moved when I was 2, from a smaller starter home to our current house. But I'd never seen that first house. They said it was across town, but they'd get vague about the actual address. Now I wondered if we'd really lived there at all, or if those baby pictures had been taken somewhere else entirely. I reached out to other family members, 2 cousins, aunts, uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. I was careful about what I said, not wanting to reveal what I knew until I was ready. But I asked questions. Casual questions about family history, about old times, about people I'd heard mentioned but never really known. And I listened carefully to the answers. Some family members were guarded, clearly uncomfortable with my questions. They'd give vague answers and try to change the subject. Others, especially the ones who had been marginalized in the family, were more forthcoming. They had their own grievances, their own pieces of information they'd been sitting on for years. One cousin told me about a huge fight at a family reunion before I was born. Apparently, my father and his brother had nearly come to blows over something. Family members had to separate them. That brother, Uncle Tom, had left early and barely spoke to our family after that. When I asked what the fight was about, my cousin said nobody would tell her, but she overheard something about the truth and what's right. An aunt on my mother's side told me that my mother had disappeared for several months when she was in her early 20s. Just dropped out of school, stopped communicating with her family. When she finally came back, she was different, quieter, more withdrawn. She never explained where she'd been or what had happened. The family just learned not to ask about that missing time. The most shocking conversation was with Uncle Tom himself. He'd moved across the country 20 years ago, ostensibly for a job, but really, I suspected now, to get away from our family drama. I found his number through an online people finder service and called him out of the blue. When I told him who I was, there was a long silence on the line. Then he sighed heavily, like he'd been expecting this call for years. "I was wondering when someone would finally tell you the truth," he said. "Or when you'd figure it out yourself. I tried, when you were younger. But your parents made it very clear I wasn't welcome if I didn't keep my mouth shut." Uncle Tom told me things that night that filled in huge gaps in my understanding. He told me about arguments he'd had with my father over the years. About times he'd threatened to tell me everything. About the price he'd paid for trying to do the right thing, being cut off from his family, not being allowed to attend gatherings if he wouldn't agree to stay silent, not being allowed to see me grow up. My parents had essentially forced the entire extended family to choose. Either go along with the lies or be cut out. Most people chose to maintain peace, even if it meant living with lies. "I thought about writing you a letter when you turned 18, Uncle Tom said. "I had it drafted and everything, but I was afraid of what it would do to you. I thought maybe it was better if you never knew. I thought maybe sometimes ignorance really is bliss." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry I didn't try harder. I'm sorry I let them silence me. You deserved better than that." By this point, I had amassed a mountain of evidence. Documents, testimonies, records, photos, videos, recorded phone calls. I knew more about my family's past than probably anyone alive except my parents themselves. I had a timeline of events. I had a list of everyone who knew and who they'd told. I had financial records showing money trails. I had legal documents showing the full scope of what had been done and what had been covered up. And what I'd learned made me physically sick. The lies were worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just about protecting me or avoiding awkward conversations. They were about protecting my parents' reputations, their social standing, their version of themselves. The consequences of their lies had affected more people than I'd thought possible, not just me, but others who had been hurt, marginalized, erased from the family history, because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths. I was ready for the confrontation, but I also knew that once I did this, there was no coming back from it. My relationship with my parents would never be the same. The upcoming wedding that Mark and I had been planning was now in serious jeopardy. How could I celebrate the start of my new family when my old family was built on lies? My sense of identity, of who I was and where I came from, had been shattered. I spent nights lying awake, wondering if confronting them would accomplish anything or just create more pain. But I knew I had to do it. I deserved the truth, even if it was decades too late. I deserved to hear them say it, to admit what they'd done. I deserved answers, explanations, and acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. And I was going to get them, no matter what it took. But just when I thought I had all the pieces, I got a phone call that changed everything again. It was from a lawyer representing someone I'd never heard of. They wanted to meet with me regarding a matter of inheritance and family estate. I almost didn't take the meeting, figuring it was some kind of scam, but something made me go. The lawyer's office was downtown, all dark wood and expensive furniture. He sat me down and told me that I'd been named in someone's will, a woman I'd never met who had died 3 months ago. And here's where it gets crazy. This woman had left me a substantial amount of money and a letter explaining why. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. The letter inside was several pages long, written in neat, careful handwriting. As I read, I realized this woman had been following my life from a distance for years. She knew things about me that she shouldn't have known, my college major, my job, even details about Mark. And she had information about my family that I hadn't uncovered in all my investigating. She had been part of the story from the beginning. In fact, she had been trying to protect me all these years, setting up this inheritance as a way to help me once I learned the truth. Reading her letter, I discovered there was another layer to this whole thing that I hadn't known about. The secrets went back even further than I thought. My grandparents had been involved too. There were decisions made before my parents were even married that had set all of this in motion. It wasn't just about my parents' lies. It was about generational trauma and secrets that had been passed down through the family like some terrible inheritance. The woman's letter also revealed something else that made my blood run cold. One of the people I'd trusted in my investigation, one of the people who had been helping me uncover the truth, had actually been trying to control what I found out. They had been feeding me certain information while hiding other parts. They had their own agenda, their own reasons for wanting me to know some things and not others. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. How could I trust anything anymore? How could I believe anyone? The more I learned, the more complicated and painful this became. I wasn't just dealing with my parents' lies anymore. I was dealing with a web of deception that involved multiple people, spanning multiple generations, with consequences I was only beginning to understand. The confrontations didn't happen all at once. They unfolded over weeks, each one more painful than the last. The first was with my father. He'd been released from the hospital and was recovering at home. I showed up one evening, let myself in with my key, and found him sitting in his recliner watching TV. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my voice made him mute the television and turn to look at me. I think he knew, in that moment, that the day he'd been dreading for decades had finally arrived. I laid it all out for him. Everything I'd found, everyone I'd talked to, every lie I'd uncovered. I watched his face go through a series of expressions: shock, denial, fear, resignation. When I finally finished, there was a long silence. Then he started to cry. My father, who I'd never seen shed a tear, was sobbing like a child. What he told me next took hours. He didn't try to deny anything. Instead, he explained. He told me about the decisions he and my mother had made when they were young, decisions that seemed right at the time but that they'd come to regret. He told me about the pressure they'd been under, the limited options they thought they had. He told me about every lie they'd told and why they'd told it. He apologized over and over, saying he'd wanted to tell me countless times but never found the courage. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I thought if you never knew, you'd never be hurt. I thought we could just move forward and pretend the past didn't exist. I see now how wrong I was. I see now that the lies hurt you more than the truth ever could have." But I wasn't done. After confronting my father, I confronted other family members. My mother's sister, who had known everything and said nothing. My paternal grandmother, my father's mother, who was still alive and who had been complicit in setting up the lies in the first place. Each confrontation revealed more details, more justifications, more excuses. Some family members were defensive. They told me I was being too harsh, that I didn't understand how different things were back then, that they'd done the best they could. Others were apologetic, saying they'd wanted to tell me but felt it wasn't their place. A few were angry, accusing me of dragging up the past and causing unnecessary drama. The confrontation with my mother was perhaps the hardest. We met at a neutral location, a park near my old elementary school. We walked while we talked, and I asked her the questions I'd been holding on to. Why had she lied to me? How could she look me in the eye every day knowing she was keeping such huge secrets? Did she ever feel guilty? Did she ever think about how I'd feel when I found out? Her answers were complicated. Yes, she'd felt guilty, every single day, but she'd convinced herself it was for the best. She told herself that the truth would only hurt me, that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me. She'd built up these lies in her mind as protection rather than deception. And once the lies had been told, they became easier to maintain. One lie led to another and another, until the truth seemed impossible to tell. "I love you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything I did because I love you. I know that doesn't make it right. I know I should have told you the truth, but I was scared. Scared of losing you, scared of you hating me, and the longer I waited, the scarier it became." But perhaps the most shocking confrontation was with Mark, my fiancé. I finally told him everything. The secrets I'd uncovered, the lies my family had told, the truth about who I was and where I came from. I expected him to be shocked, supportive, sympathetic. Instead, he went very quiet. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. And what he told me next nearly broke me. He'd known, not everything, but enough. His family and my family had connections I hadn't known about. Loose connections through friends of friends and distant relatives, but connections nonetheless. He'd heard rumors over the years, pieces of the story, and he'd never said anything. I thought it was just gossip, he said. I thought it couldn't possibly be true. And then, even when I started to think maybe it was true, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to be the one to hurt you. I thought maybe you'd be happier not knowing. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Even Mark, the person I was supposed to marry, the person I trusted most in the world, had been keeping things from me. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. We had a massive fight. I told him the engagement was off. He begged me to reconsider, said we could work through this. But I needed space. I needed to figure out who I was before I could figure out who I wanted to be with. The confrontations took a toll on me. I lost weight. I stopped sleeping well. My work performance suffered. Friends who didn't know what was going on started to worry about me, but I couldn't explain it to them. How do you tell people that your entire life has been a lie, that everyone you trusted has been deceiving you? The aftermath of all these confrontations was devastating. My family essentially fell apart. My parents separated for a while, each blaming the other for how everything had come out. My mother moved in with her sister. My father stayed in the house, but he was a shell of himself, drinking more, barely leaving his room. Extended family members took sides. Some supported me, saying I had every right to be angry and that the truth needed to come out. Others thought I was being cruel and vindictive, dredging up the past and tearing the family apart. Holiday gatherings became impossibilities. The family unit that had seemed so solid, so dependable, just dissolved. Mark and I tried to work things out. We went to couples counseling. We had long, painful conversations about trust and honesty and what it means to really know someone. But in the end, we couldn't get past it. The wedding was officially called off. We divided up our shared belongings, broke our lease, and went our separate ways. It was one more loss in a year full of losses. I started seeing a therapist individually as well. I was diagnosed with complex PTSD from all the revelations and betrayals. I struggled with depression and anxiety. Some days, I couldn't get out of bed. Other days, I'd throw myself into work or exercise or anything that would keep my mind off what had happened. But slowly, very slowly, I started to rebuild. I started to figure out who I was separate from the lies I'd been told. I reconnected with some of the people I'd discovered during my investigation, people who were part of the true story of my family. I formed new relationships based on honesty rather than deception. I also had to make some hard decisions. Did I want to maintain a relationship with my parents? With other family members who had lied to me? Where were my boundaries? What could I forgive and what couldn't I? These weren't easy questions, and the answers changed over time. About 6 months after everything came out, my parents asked to meet with me. They wanted to try to repair our relationship. We met at a family therapist's office, neutral territory where we could talk with a mediator present. That first session was brutal. There was a lot of anger, a lot of tears, a lot of things that had been left unsaid finally being spoken aloud. But we kept going back. Week after week, we worked through the damage that had been done. My parents had to accept responsibility for their actions. They had to understand the depth of harm they'd caused, and I had to decide whether I could forgive them, whether I wanted them in my life going forward. It's been 2 years now since I found that box in my parents' attic. 2 years since my world came crashing down. And I can say that things are better, though they'll never be the same. I have a new relationship with my parents. One that's more honest, but also more distant. We see each other occasionally, talk on the phone every few weeks. But the easy closeness we once had is gone. That was built on lies, and you can't go back to that once you know the truth. I've also rebuilt my life in other ways. I changed jobs, moved to a new city, started fresh. I've made new friends who know the whole story and accept me for who I really am. I've even started dating again, though I'm much more cautious now about who I trust and how quickly. So where does that leave me now? I'm not going to lie and say everything's perfect because it's not. I still have hard days. Days when I'm angry about what was done to me. Days when I miss the innocence of not knowing, of believing my family was who I thought they were. Days when I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd never found that box. But I also know that living with the truth, as painful as it is better than living with lies. I know who I really am now. Not the person my parents pretended I was, but who I actually am. And that's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. I've learned that families are complicated, that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible mistakes, and then compound those mistakes by trying to hide them. I've learned that love and deception can coexist, that people can genuinely care about you while still lying to you. I've learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living in ignorance. I've also learned to trust my instincts. All those years when I felt like something was off, when I sensed there were secrets being kept, I was right. I've learned to pay attention to those feelings, to not dismiss my own perceptions just because others tell me I'm wrong. As for my family, we're rebuilding. Slowly. Some relationships are healing faster than others. Some may never fully heal, and I've made peace with that. I've accepted that I can't control how other people respond to the truth being revealed. I can only control my own response, my own choices about who I let into my life and on what terms. I think about that woman sometimes, the one who came to our door when I was 7 years old, crying and saying I deserved to know the truth. I wish I could find her now, tell her she was right. I wish I could thank her for trying, even though my mother turned her away. I wonder how different my life might have been if someone had told me the truth earlier. But I also know that some lessons can only be learned at the right time. To anyone else out there who's discovered family secrets, who's learned that the people they trusted most were lying to them, I see you. I know how much it hurts. I know how disorienting it is to have your sense of reality shattered. I know how hard it is to rebuild from that. But I also want you to know that it's possible. You can survive this. You can build a new life, a truer life, on the other side of the lies. The truth did hurt. It hurt more than I could have imagined. But it also set me free. Free to be who I really am, free to form relationships based on honesty, free to live without the weight of secrets I didn't even know I was carrying. And that freedom, as hard one as it was, is worth everything I lost to get it. My family's secrets are no longer secret. The lies have been exposed, the truth is out there, and I'm still standing. Scarred, changed, but still standing. And if I can do it, so can you. The truth will set you free, even if it breaks your heart first.